Hello, and welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. Today, I want to talk to you about a genre that I particularly enjoy, that of urban fantasy. I want to talk about how you world build for urban fantasy, the potential pitfalls in writing or running a game in urban fantasy, and what plot elements work best with urban fantasy worlds. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode, and let's get cracking. First, what is urban fantasy? It is very simply fantasy set in a real-world city. It doesn't have to be contemporary, so it doesn't have to be London today. It could be London in the 1800s as an example. But it does have to be set in a city, and that city must exist in the real world at some time. This means that there are some names which seem as though they should be part of the genre that are excluded. An example is Harry Potter is not urban fantasy. Percy Jackson is not urban fantasy. They're both examples of contemporary fantasy, fantasy set in the current day and age, in the current world, but not in an urban setting. Typically, you identify urban fantasy by its use of fantasy tropes, its urban setting, there must be magic or other fantastical elements. It's often, but not always, a noir kind of setting and feeling. There should be mythical creatures, and normally your protagonist is both a normal and part of the fantastical world. What this means is that you wouldn't write your urban fantasy from the perspective of a creature that only exists in the secret magical part of the urban fantasy. Then it's not really an urban fantasy. It's more of a traditional fantasy that has some impact on our world. So your protagonist would ideally be somebody who lives in the real world, but also interacts with the magical. So I spoke about having a foot in both worlds. This brings us to the first big point of urban fantasy world building. There are different types of urban fantasy. First, you have what I would call traditional urban fantasy, which is the secret world. In the secret world type of urban fantasy, your magical or fantastical part is kept secret from the bulk of humanity. We, the humans who inhabit this world we live in, we don't know about this magical part. So everything else carries on. Our history carries on as normal. All the things carry on as normal. But there is this secret magical world that must be kept away from humanity's knowledge. Examples of this is the Dresden Files, Vampire the Masquerade, the role-playing game, and the Stargate series from a sci-fi perspective. If you are writing such a urban fantasy, the biggest consideration you have is how is the world kept secret? You can go in two directions on this. It can either be mystical or non-mystical. In a mystical solution, what would happen is something like Percy Jackson's Mist, where mortals, humans, don't really see the world for what it is. They don't see the truth. And there is some mystical element that prevents them from seeing the truth. This reduces your risk of exposure so that you can have more spectacular effects. You can have battles that destroy a whole city, and somehow the magic will keep the secret from the normal human population. It does also massively reduce the tension that is brought by this trope. So it actually undermines, in my opinion, it undermines the strength of the secret world trope. One of the biggest tension-inducing elements in this kind of urban fantasy is what happens if the secret comes out. And you can see this very clearly in the Dresden Files. In the Dresden Files, humans are seen as the nuclear option by the fantasy world. Why? Because while humans aren't individually as powerful as any given fantasy monster, there are so many of them. And numbers matter. If you put 8 billion humans against a fantasy monster because they are frightened of its power, your fantasy monster is quite likely to end up in a severely hurt condition. And that is why humanity is seen as the nuclear option in the Dresden Files, and nobody wants the secret of the fantasy world to get out to them. Everybody has oaths and secrets and promises to each other and within their own societies, their own fantastical societies, to preserve the secrets and to not let humanity know about what is going on. This builds real tension. What happens if the secret gets out? And when really big things happen, like in the last book of the Dresden Files in Battlegrounds, I'm kind of on tenterhooks to find out what happens in the next book, because I don't see how the events of Battlegrounds can be kept secret from humanity. So as a reader, I'm like, what's going to happen here? Is humanity going to find out? What's going to happen to the magical universe? How will everything change? What this kind of secrecy also allows you to do is to have certain plot elements tied to cover-ups. A great example of this comes from Stargate, the episodes focused around Wormhole Extreme. So in the Stargate universe, Wormhole Extreme is an in-world TV series that is about a team of military operatives that go through a Stargate to other worlds to explore them. The reason why the Stargate Military Command allows this TV series to be shot is because it provides a cover story. So it is a kind of future-proofing of, if anything leaks about the Stargate program, they can go, oh, no, don't be ridiculous. Look, it's those Wormhole Extreme guys. That's where the story comes from. It's just a legend. It's just a TV show. And so you can have plot lines that are just about setting up future cover-ups or about covering up what has happened now. That being said, you do need to be careful here. If you overuse the plot device of the secret getting out, eventually your readers are going to be like, oh, not again. Are you kidding me? Another the secret's going to get out storyline? But what does happen if the secret does get out? Or what happens if it was never a secret in the first place? And that brings us to the open world urban fantasy setting. An example of this is the Bartimaeus sequence, which I can highly recommend and was recommended to me by one of the viewers of this channel. This is more of an alternative history setting, but for me it still qualifies as an urban fantasy setting, just an open one. Everybody knows that magic is real. Now, how magic is enabled in the Bartimaeus sequence is mages summon demons, and they bind these demons to their will. They bind them to the activities they want to partake in. What makes this series great is that one of the points of view characters is Bartimaeus, a demon that is summoned by a kid mage in order to enact that kid's revenge. In this kind of world, you have to apply a lot of research. As I said, this is a form of alternative history genre. And if you write alternative history and you get the history part wrong, fans of the genre will eat you alive and they will spit out your bones for the hyenas to chew on. It is incredibly important in this kind of situation that you do a lot of research into the actual historical time period that you are writing in, even if that is today's contemporary period. You also need to understand the forces that shape the current day. You need to understand the historical trends and then go, okay, but what if I inserted magic? Our systems of monarchy was replaced by democracy over time. And one of the reasons for that is because people wanted a say in their government and they stopped believing that kings had the divine right to rule because they stopped believing so deeply in all of the kind of mystical elements around your birth and you being chosen by God and all of the rest of that. What happens if kings were actually mages? What happens if they had incredible personal power. Would democracy ever have arisen if our kings were all mages? What impact would it have on our history to have that kind of magical element introduced? This is what makes alternative history such an attractive genre. And when you combine that with urban fantasy, setting it all in a single city, you can really explore the depths of having fantastical elements openly acknowledged in a current day and age world. So that is secret worlds and open worlds. There is one more type of urban fantasy setting, and that is the recently revealed setting. Now, your secret world can become your recently revealed world if the secret comes out. One of the most famous examples of the recently revealed world is the True Blood series on HBO, which is based on the Southern Vampire Mysteries by Charlaine Harris. In this series, vampires have just revealed their existence to humanity. The reason why they've revealed their existence to humanity is because there is a substitute for human blood that they can drink called True Blood. And this has therefore enabled them to survive without harming humans, and that's why they've now come out of the closet, as it were. This kind of recent revelation of a fantasy world existing has got a lot of plot elements that you can play with. There is the tension between humans who don't want to accept this new reality and humans who do want to accept the new reality, with the fantastical elements caught between them. You have new economies spawning from the fantastical. This is shown in True Blood, not just with the True Blood itself, but also in the criminal element. Vampire blood is addictive. It is a drug-like substance that makes humans more powerful, that affects them like a drug. And so harvesting of vampire blood from vampires has become part of the criminal underground, and trade in vampire blood has become a part of what criminals offer. And then you have people who want to unring that bell, people who want to hunt down the fantasy monsters. Now their actions are illegal, but human police might not want to put these guys behind bars. So you've got a lot of tension, a lot going on there, many threads to pull on in order to create a rich environment with a lot of story. There are some pitfalls here. Once your fantastical society has been accepted, you need to be able to transition to your more open society setting. Because if you keep telling the story about how it's difficult to be accepted in this new world, that's going to get boring to your readers. Also, bear in mind that this bell cannot be unrung. If you started in the secret world and you then revealed to go to the recently revealed world, there's no going back. You can't go back to the secret world from the revealed world. The only path is forward to the openly accepted world. Once you've revealed the existence of the fantasy to humans, once the nuclear option has been engaged, you cannot go back to how it was before. At least not without massive deus ex machina, which you would certainly lose me as a reader or as a player in your fantasy world. And that is my take on urban fantasy and how to world build for it. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode of Just in Time Worlds. If there are other genres that you would like me to discuss, please do comment below and I will do my best to get around to them. Please do give this video a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time Worlds.